response, which can be found at emmadonahue.com, is late 18th century London, England. I'd be a rich spinster of scandalous habits. My hats would be enormous. Chocolate drops would have been recently invented, and there'd be revolutions to provide a little excitement. And with that rather marvelous picture in our minds, please join me in welcoming Emma Donoghue.
Thank you for that lovely, kindly introduction. Can everyone hear me? Of course, you can't hear if I'm asking the question. I should be a little louder, yes? I don't think the microphone goes up any higher, so... Katie's running towards me purposefully. It does go up higher?
I'm not here.
Oh, she's changing the settings. Is that better? Is that better? Yes? Oh, thank you so much, Katie. Fantastic. Otherwise, I'd have headed off to the West Coast bit of my tour with a bad back from stooping. The only problem with such a long, kind introduction, a kind of tour through my resume, is that doesn't it make me sound about 70? But it's because I've never had a real job. You know, most writers you meet have put in their time in interesting jobs which give them material. I've never had any real job, so I've had to delve into history for my material because I've lived very little, really. Frog Music was meant to be entirely about the most slippery of the characters I'll be talking about tonight, Jenny Bonnet, and she was literally a slippery character in that she was a frog catcher. A curious trade, but she seems to have made a good living from catching sackfuls of live frogs and delivering them to the Chinese and French restaurants of San Francisco, of which there were about 300. And you had to deliver them live so that they'd be fresh. And you had to throw a few cockroaches into the bag to provide something for the frogs to eat, or else they would eat each other in the night. That's the kind of detail that rings my bell. Some of the research for this historical novel, by the way, was done on YouTube, where you can see Louisiana folk catching frogs with their bare hands and peeling them live. So let's not underestimate the importance of contemporary sources in illuminating past situations. It's extremely nice to be here. This clearly is the academic institution where I am most taught. I had no idea that I'm sprinkled like salt across the entire curriculum, and I'm blushing. I'm going to start with reading you a little scene, and then I'm going to give you a wee talk about using historical documents, and then I'll finish with another little wee scene. This is a scene in which, well, I should explain, right? This novel was meant to be about Jenny, who was shot dead through a window and whose the murder has never been solved. And in her cross-dressing, in her frog catching, she had to cross-dress. You can't go frog catching in a big skirt, but then she would wear her trousers in the evening as well. And for this eccentricity, she was quite well known in San Francisco as a bit of a character, but she was also arrested roughly once a month under San Francisco's peculiar anti-cross-dressing laws. So as you can tell, she was an incredibly modern figure who would be just routine on the streets of San Francisco today, but was not in 1876. So the novel was meant to be about her, but there was another woman in the grimy bar when the bullets came through the window and killed Jenny Bonnet. And the other woman was, again, French in origin like Jenny, but more recently arrived. She'd only arrived a year before, a dancer called Blanche Benon, who'd come over with her lover Arthur and his friend Ernest from Paris, where they'd been circus folk, and she was working as a dancer and high-priced prostitute. And the novel became very much Blanche's story, and Blanche's point of view leads us through it. And there's an interesting moment in the sources where Blanche turns to the coroner who was running the inquest on Jenny's death, and Blanche says, "And my lover Arthur, he's taken away our baby, and I don't know where our baby is." Now this baby is never named, and you never find out what happens to the baby. And the search for Blanche's baby becomes, in a way, the other half of the mystery of this mystery novel. So in this particular scene, Blanche has been having her baby nursed out almost since birth, and that was a more common option back in the day than now. Now you'd be considered pretty hard-hearted indeed if you had your baby full-time in some kind of foster care. But in those days it was more common, and Blanche has had the vague impression that her child is on a farm outside San Francisco. But in this particular scene, Blanche has been talking to the madam at the brothel where she dances, and has realized that in fact this so-called farm is on Folsom Street in the Mission area of San Francisco. Number 1422 turns out to be next door to a Chinese laundry that sends out coils of smoke in all directions. It's a wary adolescent girl who answers the door, not the uniformed nurse who usually brings Petit to the House of Mirrors for his visits. "Doctress has just stepped out," she mutters. Blanche is hit by the eye-watering reek of shit. "Who's this doctress?" she demands. "Doctress Hoffman, she's just stepped out. Wish to leave a message. What name?" Blanche has been steeling her nerves, half expecting bedlam, babies shrieking, but this silence is worse. How can it be so quiet? She says, "Where do you keep the infants?" The nursemaid's eyes flicker. "Doctress is..." "Yes, just stepped out. Yes, I heard you," says Blanche, "but what I want to know is, where's my son?" "What name?" says the girl. "Benon," says Blanche. I mean Deneuve. His name is Deneuve, like his father. And she pushes past the rigid girl and she tries the first door on the right. It opens. "No, that's for appointments," says the girl, and she yanks the knob, shutting the door again, but not before Blanche catches a glimpse of a narrow bed, a sink, and a rack of instruments, and she realizes what appointments must mean. The nursemaid girl has more grit than one would expect. She takes her stand between Blanche and the second door, her arms out. "They're having their nap," she says. Blanche's pulse is hammering in her throat now. She says, "I pay $8 a week for my baby's care and lodging here, and I believe I have the right to see him." And while the nursemaid is still blinking at her, Blanche shoves past her and opens the door. So dark. That's what strikes her first, even more than the hot distillation of the stink. Her eyes fight to make sense of the shapes. Crib after metal crib, littered with small limbs. "Oh, Christ, open the shutters!" "That'll only let more heat in," the girl protests. Blanche fumbles her way over to the window, forcing her skirt in between two cribs. "Which one is yours?" asks the girl. Instead of answering, Blanche grabs a handle and winches till light slants across the room. Weak, goatish cries go up from the babies. 2 small ones in one crib, 3 in the next. Tear-shaped glass bottles in mouths, or gone crusty on chests, or lost in corners with their black rubber teeth dribbling onto the sheets. And every baby is tangled in the same size garment, once white. Eyes closed, or blinking wetly, or open and vacant. All big and small, strangely inanimate. With a sensation like a blow to her chest, Blanche finally recognizes the tribe her son belongs to. Her eyes slide from crib to crib as she pinches her nose to shut out the smell, but she can't see her Petit anywhere. The foot of one face-down sleeper flickers and curls, and with a pounding relief, Blanche spots the soft sole and seizes it and then scoops up her son. He seems so much bigger than when she saw him on the last visit at the House of Mirrors, and she presses kisses all over his howling face. "I said that one's a girl," says the nursemaid. Blanche is scarlet. Depositing the stranger child back in her crib, she wipes the foreign tears off her own mouth. "Upset her, so you did, picking her up like that," complains the nursemaid. "Well, are you telling me that they lie here all day in their own dirt with nobody picking them up?" roars Blanche, her eyes scanning the shadowy corners of the room. "Where is Petit?" "I do what I can," says the girl. But Blanche is not listening because she has recognized her baby at last, in the end crib. She approaches Petit cautiously in case he turns into another changeling. But no, that is him, lying on his side, gigantic eyes sunken above patches of hot red skin, watching Blanche through the bars as if she's a wild beast. A bulging forehead, but Arthur's pencil-thin eyebrows arching across it. How could Blanche not have known her own baby? He's chewing on something mushroom-shaped. A doorknob. Blanche holds out her hands to him with an attempt at a smile, but he doesn't stir. She lifts Petit carefully. His small garment is limp with sweat, and he lets out a sob, and then a convulsive cough, and Blanche feels such pity that she presses him to her, and she registers a surge of warmth against her bodice. It must be love, she thinks in shock. Love flaring up between herself and this sobbing baby she barely knows. Love so hot she can actually feel it on her skin. And then the heat dies away and she realizes what it is. He's pissed on her. The nursemaid is moving from crib to crib, slotting bottles back into mouths. And Blanche can't bear this room a minute longer. She is tempted to set down the wailing, sobbing bundle that is her son exactly where she found him, but of course she won't. She can't. She could never do that now that she knows what it's like here. She couldn't look herself in the face. So she pulls him onto her hip and she makes for the passage. "The shirt, if you please," says the girl, too close to her. "What? What are you talking about?" shouts Blanche over the baby's cries. "I need the nightshirt back." "Is this a joke?" says Blanche. "Any parent that own clothing to be provided on departure." "See," says the girl with the rapid delivery of a memorized lesson. "Own clothing to be provided on departure because it's the doctor's property and she's particular about it." For a moment, Blanche is tempted to pull the sodden rag up over Petit's head and throw it in the girl's face. Instead, she steps away. But the girl clings to Petit's hem. "The shirt or its value," she pleads, "or the doctors will dock me." "Here's its value," says Blanche, and she spits on the floor. The girl's grip has shifted to Petit's tiny foot. "Take your hands off my son!" Blanche yanks him away, and Petit is still weeping as his reddened mouth fastens onto the black doorknob and he twists away from Blanche as best he can. And the girl mutters, "Reckon he knows my hands better than yours." And the truth of that fills Blanche with a wild fury. I'll leave that there. Somebody asked me yesterday whether, as the writer of historical fiction, I was against the internet. She seemed to think that I was, such a purist, that I was always going to be in archives lifting down giant books like the Grimoire and Harry Potter, books so ancient and precious that they're tied to the library shelves. And I said to her, the internet is the best thing that ever happened to historical fiction. And researching historical fiction in some ways nowadays is much easier. There are simply many more resources that you can get to. So I remember sometimes I used to read the author's note at the end of a historical novel, and it would say, "Thank you all those kind friends who hosted me over the 10 years I spent going through the villages of Umbria." And I would think, oh, how delightful that was. But many of us are not free to spend 10 years going through the villages of Umbria. So I have to say that frog music in particular, I think because it's relatively modern in its setting, in 1870s, I was able to do research for this novel online that I honestly couldn't have done even 10 or 15 years ago when these resources were not online. And pictures, for instance, I used a huge amount of 19th century photography, not just for the buildings of the day, but for entire streetscapes that crumbled in the San Francisco earthquake and fire of 1906. So there's a lost San Francisco that you can only find in the photographs. I also used full text books themselves and a lot of sort of bureaucratic records. So at first, when I was plunging into my search for facts about Jenny Bonnet, I had this sense of infinite power. At first, it all seemed great because I realized that by using either free databases or subscription databases, I could access 19th century birth records, immigration records, voting, marriage, death records, as well as newspapers. I particularly drew on a lot of databases of 19th century American newspapers. And there were times, however, that I thought I was going to damage my eyesight or my mental health because they are basically facsimiles, and no matter how far in you zoom, they're very hard to read. 19th century newsprint was typeset very close, I suppose, to save the price of paper, and often you have to flick through page after page to find the article you need, or very often it's unlabeled continuation after many ads for corsets and patent medicines. So often a headline will alert you to the content of the first bit, but then you're searching through 10 pages of close script to find the entirely unlabeled continuation. And so actually it's really just as uncomfortable as spooling through microfilms in a library used to be. If the documents are handwritten ones, such as marriage or birth records, it's even worse because you actually have to puzzle out the official script. In both cases, 19th century writers, whether journalists or bureaucrats, they were wildly casual about the spelling of names. And if they didn't know a first name, it seems to me they would simply invent one. So Jenny Bonnet, the murder victim I was researching, some articles would just give her parents' names. It was like Paul and Virginie, they would just pop in random names. Now, one of the most inexhaustible resources I used is the US Federal Census. I drew on the census records of 1870 to see what all my characters were up to a few years before the murder happened, and then 1880, 1900, and 1910. Sadly, 1890 is almost entirely gone. There was a fire in the 30s, and even though quite a few bits of it were left over, the government seems to have decided, oh, well, that one's a write-off, we'll just destroy the rest of it. But the census records, they were crucial not just for dates and places, but tiny nitty-gritties about the real people in my novel. And my novel features about 26 real people. I didn't have to use all those real people. I could have simply made a lot of them up, but I kept coming across wonderful real ones. It would tell me things like what they worked at, whether they were literate, how much property they had, who they lived beside, who they lived with. And in particular, I have to thank the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, because you may not know this, but they like to baptize all their ancestors so that their whole family will be gathered to heaven together. I hope I'm getting the theology right here. But then they freely share these amazing genealogical records with the rest of the world free. So in a Mormon database, I discovered the crucial fact of one of my characters having quickly got married to somebody new a bare 2 months after the murder. Now, often you end up with a lot of interesting data about people who may be the ones you're looking for, but you're not quite sure, because they might be people with the same name. And one problem in general with writing historical fiction is the paucity of names. The number of plays and novels I've written about people called Mary, Elizabeth, or John. I'm so glad there are so many wildly individualistic names around these days, because really in the past it seems like there were only about 10 names. So where Jenny got shot, and that's not a spoiler because she gets shot on page 1, she got shot in this grimy bar that belonged to an Irish couple called John and Ellen McNamara. And I have to tell you, a lot of John and Ellen McNamara's left Ireland and moved to America. So at one point I had about 8 of them on the go, and I kept finding as many facts as I could about them, trying to locate which ones were the ones who were hosting Jenny the night she got shot. I mean, I've got a bog standard Irish surname myself, so I know it would be the same if I was looking for John and Mary Donoghue. And I was deeply grateful to Jenny's father when it turned out that he had such a distinctive first name as Sosthenes. I've never met any other Sosthenes, so I was relieved to find him. When you're trying to track down the long-time dead, even ones with unusual names, complete dead ends are common. Of course, for a novelist, dead ends are quite a gift, because a lot of the points where a historian would be frustrated and have to more or less, draw a line, a novelist goes, oh, fine, I'll make this bit up. And I know it might seem a little bit perverse, because if I like making it up, why do I care so much about finding the facts that I can find? All I can say is it's 2 different sides of the same thing for me. I love pure invention, but I also love the stimulus that the facts give me. I love to sort of springboard between the two, and maybe it's because I did a PhD and I have that academic background. I absolutely love the attempt to figure out as much as we can possibly find out about what really did happen before I sort of take flight into fiction. It was sometimes a disheartening experience to search really every source I could find for one particular person. For instance, there's a man who the police ultimately decided to blame for Jenny's killing, and I don't think it was true at all, because by the time they fingered him, as it were, he was already dead and he was Canadian. So I think to blame a dead foreigner, that's just too convenient. So I don't believe it at all. But anyway, I could never track him down in the sources. So there I was, say, in the Canadian archives in Ottawa, looking for him with every variation on his spelling. And because his was a French name, the American newspapers spelled him about 5 different ways. Sometimes they called him Pierre Louis, sometimes they called him Louis Pierre, sometimes they did Logis, and I was never sure was that just a misprint for Louis. And his surname seems to have been de Framont, and they spelled that 6 different ways. So I kept looking for him, never found him. And then there's another factor of difficulty in using these sources, which is optical character recognition. And this sounds lovely in that they take a handwritten source like a ship's passenger list, and the computer just magically scans it and turns it into print. But I would say it has its limits. For instance, even if it finds you the right word, it'll show you many things which are not the person you're looking for. So for instance, my murder victim, I knew that her first name was sometimes Jeanne, sometimes Jenny with an I-E rather than a Y, and her surname was Bonnet, but unfortunately this is spelled just like bonnet, and so I had to flick through more ads for bonnets than you would imagine. And there are even Jeanne d'Arc bonnets, and there are Jenny Lind bonnets, so I spent an awful lot of time going, oh, there's the familiar shape of a bonnet, let's move on to the next one. And 19th century newspapers are often smeary, and they are sprinkled with misspellings anyway, and so the digitized versions of these texts can read like complete gobbledygook. So here's one line verbatim from a digitized article about the murder. So this was a printed source, not even handwritten. It was printed, but when scanned by the computer and turned into text, it became oddly Dutch. So here's the line. I'm going to give it to you as they wrote it. No, actually, I'll give it to you the way I think it really was first. I think what they were trying to say was, suspicion fixed itself on him and on one of his friends, Ernest Girard. As it was supposed, they bore Jeanne ill will for the part she had taken in persuading Blanche to leave her paramour. Okay? But what it came up as was, suspecon fixed itilf on him and on unuv bit fritnandi, Ernest Girard, as it what tap posed to be bore Jeanne ill will for Tibi part she had taken in perladag Blanche to leave ber paramar. Swear to God, there's 4 A's in the paramar. So you need, as you can tell, persistence, and you need some lateral thinking in using these sources as well. So for instance, I was struggling to find out whether Blanche, whose name is sometimes given as Blanche Benoit, sometimes Benon, sometimes Benon, and her lover Arthur Deneuve, sometimes as one word, sometimes as two. I was trying to find out when they came to San Francisco, because I had the sense they'd been there about a year, but I was curious when they came, when they had the baby, that sort of thing. So I scoured every source I could think of in their native France and in California, but I couldn't spot them. And I knew they weren't the type to do things like vote or marry or, sign up for anything respectable. And so I just couldn't find any source of them. I knew that Blanche had owned a particular building in Sacramento Street, but those housing records seemed to be lost. And finally, I had a breakthrough. I decided that Blanche had a bit of a stripper name quality to it. I thought that could be a made-up name. The woman's an erotic dancer anyway. Would she really be called Blanche? So I decided to look for any women with the surname of Benoit or Benon. And I was trying to look for ones who would be listed near any man with the surname of Deneuve. And finally, I found them on Ancestry.com in a passenger list for a ship called the Utopia, where in 1875, in January, it was an Adèle Benon. And I thought, okay, I don't know if that's her, but she was listed right next to an Arthur Deneuve. And I thought, hang on, I'm looking for an Arthur Deneuve. And I zoomed in on the image, and it was a D, not a B. And this might seem like a petty triumph, but I was whooping. I had actually rang my partner during her office hours at the university to go, I found them in a ship's passenger list. And that might seem a little thing, but in fact that passenger list, it's just one line about each of them, and it gave me really key details. For instance, when journalists caught up with Arthur to ask him had he murdered Jenny, he gave them this whole story about being the son of a highly respected chemist in Paris, and he said he'd been the foreman of his father's chemistry firm. I was thinking, really? And then you turn up in San Francisco and you're a pimp, And the first thing that made me suspicious was that he said his father's firm was on Rue Vernot, spelled like the English words, they're not. And so I looked, and there's no Rue Vernot in Paris, and I thought, okay, was he joking? Was he kidding with them by saying, I'm from Nowhere Street? So to find the ship's passenger list and to have him list himself as an acrobat, I thought that's far more credible. You lie to the journalists when you're trying to justify yourself and prove that you're not a murderer. But if the ship's clerk says, what job? You say, I'm an acrobat. And it said Blanche was a circus rider. And that seemed a far more viable background for a pimp and a prostitute to me. So when I describe these things, I feel a bit like the crazy person at the party. And if you were a normal party guest, you'd be like, I'm just going for some peanuts. But obsession is the stuff of writing. So what can I say? I take an extreme interest in these things. Now, I don't want to give the impression that if you have broadband access, you can go it alone and completely ignore other professionals and not need any help, because you still need help. For instance, staff at several institutions were crucial in helping me figure out exactly what rare texts I was looking for in their collections, because I typically only had a couple of hours. I can't just say to my small children, I'm going off on a research trip. It's bad enough that I go off on publicity tours the last 3.5 weeks. So what I would usually do is, if my book tour was going through San Francisco, I would work out in advance that there were maybe 2 newspaper articles at the Bancroft Library I needed, and then I would write to the librarians and beg and say, could you have them ready for me at the desk, and I'll whip in and read them. And then a couple of one particular scholar who's done the only scholarly account of the case of Jenny Bonnet. She's a professor of sociology at San Francisco State, and she, as soon as I got in touch, she sent me a big, thick package of photocopies of rare articles that I've never seen anywhere else. So I find consistently the generosity of scholars. You might think that they'd be bristling at the thought that some historical fiction writer is going to make money out of their work, but not a bit. There's just enormous generosity in sharing sources. Sometimes painstaking librarians will actually do some work for you. For instance, Jenny Bonnet had a sister who was sent to the asylum, Stockton State Asylum, and the newspaper articles all said that she died there. And I wanted to check this. So I wrote to the archivist who's in charge of those records, and she looked them all up and she photocopied them, and she wrote back to say the sister didn't die, the sister had a little baby who did die. So completely different story, only because that librarian took the trouble to look it up for me. And the people who give you crucial research help, they're not always professionals either. In some ways, I think of the internet as an amazing funnel in which the private body of knowledge of many, many geeky men is funneled into the waiting mouths of historical fiction writers. For instance, mudcat.org is a great site in which guys who know folk music, well, okay, some of them may be women, but I know a lot of them are not, folk music enthusiasts share their different versions of every different folk song and who sang that one and what year was that one published. And I tracked, there are almost 30 folk songs quoted in Frog Music, and I tracked the history of almost all of them down through that site. So, and the way erudite amateurs share their knowledge nowadays is just fantastic. Of course, the tantalizing thing about documents is that you never quite come to the end of them. So, for instance, during the copy editing on this novel, during copy editing, you're meant to be just improving your grammar. But I thought, okay, it's my last chance. I'll just do one final search through those newspaper databases to see if there's any other little piece of evidence. And I found a very convincing short article about the very early death of one of my main characters, and I wept. And what's absurd is that I know that character was dead for a century and a half already. It's 2014, but somehow to know that character had not lived much longer than the extent of the novel, it just gutted me. And at that point, I knew it was, the copy editing was over, it was time to call a halt. But when you have spent several years trying to get under the skin of real people using all the tools of fiction as well as the hardest research you can do, you feel sort of responsible for them, especially if they are nobodies, if they are long forgotten people who are the ones I usually write about. So I still cannot shake the feeling that if I had tried a little harder and searched even for an hour longer, I might have found one more document. I might have filled in some crucial gap. But can't be done. I'm going to finish my talk with just a comment on a couple of minor characters in my book. Because as I say, I knew the book would be about Jenny and Blanche and the main characters, but what surprised me was how many of the minor ones sort of insisted on coming into my novel from the historical record too. In fact, one of the only ones I had to really invent was a really nice journalist. For some reason, I couldn't find a real one who was sort of in the right place at the right time, so I had to invent one. Now, I didn't want to include anyone famous because I hate the kind of compulsively name-dropping historical novel that drags in every holder of a Wikipedia entry who could plausibly have been on that continent during that decade. And in planning Frog Music, for instance, I had a forbidden sentence that I was never going to write, which was, I could just hear it in my head, "Just then Mr. Samuel Clemens strolled into the bar. Mark Twain to his legions of fans." That just gets on my tits, that kind of writing. So I even went to the lengths of leaving out one particular really interesting person who was in San Francisco around then, the photographer Edward Muybridge. He could very plausibly have hired Blanche. He hired prostitutes as his models for his amazing kind of stop-motion shots of people moving. And so I even wrote a scene in which he's hired by him and all sorts of interesting questions going on about beauty and art and science. And then I thought, no, he's distracting. His fame is distracting. And also his story was kind of drawing attention from my main story because it just so happens that Muybridge shot his wife's lover and he got away with it because he claimed brain damage from concussion. He's the first person to have successfully done that. So see what I mean? He was just too distracting. So I just carved Muybridge out. I think there's one moment when Blanche is looking at a photograph on a wall somewhere and it's a Muybridge photograph, but he had to go. But I made a lot of room in my pages for real nobodies. And I've often found that, in a way, the less you know about a person, the more easily they spring to life as fiction. So, for instance, my novel Slammerkin, published 14 years ago, is based on a single paragraph about a girl who committed a murder in the 18th century Welsh borders. So, in some ways, it's almost homeopathic. You know, the tiniest source can be the most helpful for fiction. So, for instance, the coroner at the inquest in this novel, I could have made him up, but when I was reading a history of the San Francisco mortuary, there was the one particular coroner who would have been in charge of Jenny's inquest, Coroner Swan. All I could tell from it is what a stickler he was, because he kept commenting on how he wished they had a proper morgue with cold water sprays and marble slabs and everything hygienic. You know, he was really irritated at having to use substandard facilities above an undertaker's. So that's all I needed. You know, having this wonderful stickler, it was such a contrast with all the people at the inquest who were clearly either drunk or lying their faces off. I love using legal sources because people lie so often. Every court case you read it and you just get the impression almost everybody's lying all the time. So that leaves a lot of room for authorial decisions. Another real person I put in there is that I wanted a madam for the brothel where Blanche dances. And one particular madam was mentioned in the sources, Madame Joanna Werner, and she ran a brothel on Sacramento Street, and what it was known for was virgin auctions, where really young girls would be sort of auctioned off to the highest bidder. I didn't need anything more than that. And I decided to make her a very kind of coldly managerial figure, you know, with no libidinal impulses herself, just very much like the nuns who taught me at school, very much like, I want the best for you, you know, so, you know, I need you to turn up on time, I need you to wear that costume, and let's make a lot of money at the virgin auction, you know. So, they were very, you know, my nuns were very ambitious for their girls, so I just imagined that the madam would be operating the same way. One minor character in Frog Music is that I knew I needed somebody who was visibly damaged by the sex trade, because unlike my novel Slammerkin, where prostitution is clearly very grim and brutalizing, with this novel I wanted to take a different tack, and I wanted to start the novel with Blanche thinking that it's all fine. She's earning lots of money, she's free and easy, her life is filled with pleasures. I want her to think everything's fine and then to gradually have it all come crumbling down. So I wanted there to be a kind of a visible hint to Blanche that this life could lead to bad things. And I found this in a book on San Francisco's famous police chief. I found this perfect woman. She was called Maria Lafourche, and she always claimed to be the first French prostitute in San Francisco. And she had survived an acid attack. A typical way that a woman would get punished or attacked in those days would be to have acid thrown in her face. So Maria Lafourche had kind of half a face, and yet she'd survived, and she'd managed to tell the police enough details that they'd arrested her attacker and sent him to jail. So I just thought, perfect, that's all I need. I want Maria, you know, 20 years on after that, sort of staggering around San Francisco with half a face. I'm going to finish with another little reading. And one of the hardest things to research, you'll think this is absurd, but the dancing, the erotic dancing, you might think it's self-evident what erotic dancing is. I thought at first, oh, that bit will be easy. But then I started thinking, okay, what exactly did they do? And they did not do pole dancing. They did not even strip. The idea of successively taking off your clothes, stripping, it's a French concept from the very end of the 19th century. They called it effleurage, like a shedding of petals. They were not doing it in the 1870s. And so I thought, okay, what did they do? And one of my only sources, because of course nobody was writing detailed reviews of the dirty dance they went to. Some of my only sources were pictures, because burlesque dancers and you know, mildly saucy performers, they often had promotional postcards, the pictures of themselves in costume. And these costumes suggest a lot. They're often extremely funny. You know, there's one where a girl is wearing a little dress and a horse's head, and another where she's got a kind of a Xena warrior princess breastplate, and sometimes they would be sort of semi-masculine, like they would have a military jacket with a lot of frogging and a helmet and then just tights. You know? So there was clearly elements of theatricality, of play, of whimsy. And so that's one thing I drew on. And also I did find that there were two distinct traditional erotic dances. One was the tarantella, where you would pretend there was a bug up your skirts. This doesn't appeal to us nowadays, but I think in those days when everybody had a bug up their skirts one way or another, insects were so routine that they found it quite appealing, the idea of, woo, woo, where's the bug gone? You know, I can't imagine it playing very well in a strip bar today. So the tarantella was a common one, and the skirt dance was a common one. So I'm going to read you a little scene in which Blanche, at the very start of the book, does a skirt dance. And she segues into a song. I don't know for sure if they sang, but there was such an overlap between burlesque theatre and being a sort of song and dance girl and being a dancer that I decided it was plausible enough that she would sing. At the House of Mirrors in San Francisco's Chinatown, from the piano, the soft opening chords of a waltz from Delibes' Coppelia. And in the very center of the little stage, rising like the stigma of a flower, Blanche, all in white tonight, true to her stage name. She begins very slow and stately, as chaste as any ingenue in her first role. That's the trick of the skirt dance. With delicacy, with wonder, as if she's only just discovering the sleek waterfall of white satin spilling from her waist to her toes, Blanche circles the little platform. She enfolds herself in the glossy material, 44 feet around, lingers in its caress. And she makes sure to act as if she hasn't even noticed the men in the tight rows of crimson velvet chairs, as if they aren't even there. The Grand Saloon is already packed early on this Saturday evening in the middle of August, and lamplight ricochets from the floor to ceiling looking glasses, and the red walls and the matching tufted carpet seem to pulse with heat. Inside her frilled bodice, sweat is trickling down Blanche's sides, but she holds herself as serene as any swan spreading its milky wings. She makes a screen of the vast silk skirt now to silhouette her curves, and the micheton, the customers must be leaning forward by now, eager to peer through the fabric, but she doesn't so much as cast them a glance. The sweet melody gives way to the bolder theme of Delibes' waltz, and Blanche starts to hop, to glide, to spin. She pushes every pose to its precise extreme. Face dipped to one knee, she raises the other leg behind her, pointing her toes at the gilt-coffered ceiling. The skirt slithers down her raised thigh, catching a little on the gauzy tights, threatening to turn itself entirely inside out, and a few gasps erupt from the audience, even though they can see nothing yet. What thrills them most, Blanche knows, is what they can only imagine, but she rights herself and starts waltzing again as the music returns to the calm opening tune, her face still cool, still virginal. Michetons who pay this much to watch a dance have complicated cravings. They need to be roused and refused almost at the same moment. And Blanche is an expert tease, an allumeuse who lights the flame and snuffs it, lights and snuffs it. She knows this routine so well and this famous Swanhild waltz it's set to that she can let her mind wander. She almost stumbles, but then she strikes a pose very classical, a fleeing nymph metamorphosed into marble. As the music darkens in the final section of the waltz, Blanche bends back, all the way back, till her fingers are almost stroking the boards, and she starts to spin, her whole body the trumpet of a white lily revolving helplessly on its stem. The accompaniment spirals upward, frantic, and Blanche whips upright, her swirling skirt engulfing the stage. Thunderous, triumphant chords, and at the crescendo, Blanche touches the secret tape at the small of her back, and the whole skirt flies free, creamy satin swooping towards the audience and landing, albatross-like, on a pair of old millionaires. The men's whoops break the tension, but that's all right. It wouldn't be burlesque without a few laughs. I'll leave that there, thank you. You see, in any other environment, people fleeing from the room would make me worry, but I know in a university they're fleeing for a higher purpose. There's something to learn out there, urgently.
Yes, Frank.
So, just a quick question. In your other novels, particularly Hood, I feel like you use the names of the characters so much. I mean, even in Hood, you know, you have all the versions of Penelope and obviously Cara has a double meaning with the Irish word for friend and everything. Do you kind of, in historical fiction, obviously, the names are provided for you. So do you feel that there's a bit of a loss there? Do you feel kind of liberated by that?
No, it's a bit of a loss. I wish my historical characters were called interesting things. In my contemporary fiction, I absolutely love making up the names. So yeah, Penelope in Hood is one of my favourites because it works in several ways. Yeah, I would love to be able to give them more interesting names. At least I'd never done a Jenny before. And the woman who died, she was formerly known as Jeanne Bonnet, her original French name, but then I found that in the newspapers they often called her Jenny, and I was trying to capture the way in which she was quite a local character, you know, and very sort of flippant, so I thought I'll go for Jenny in that case. And then the only interest of Blanche was when it turns out to be a stage name, so at least I had that. At least they weren't Anne and Elizabeth, because really I'm just so sick of those, you know, good solid English names. But yes, I would say picking the names is one of the great pleasures of my contemporary fiction. And of course, this distinction is not really between contemporary and historical. It's between the purely fictional, like Hood, and fiction which is based very closely on fact. Now, in fact, I would never write a contemporary novel as closely based on fact as this one is. Some people do, you know, they'll even take a famous recent murder case and they'll write about it in detail. I couldn't possibly stray into real people's lives, especially people who've suffered crimes like that. So I'm quite liberated by the fact that all these people are long dead. It actually allows me to write this kind of semi-faction, where if it was contemporary material I couldn't. So say in the case of Room, you know, it drives me nuts when people call it your Fritzl novel, because there's so little of the Fritzl case or any real crime case in it. I deliberately only held on to the basic idea of a child growing up in a locked room where a woman's been kept by a kidnapper. I made it as little like any real case as I could, but still, because of the media attraction of a terrible crime, I find if your novel has anything to do with any contemporary headline, it gets labelled that way. But in fact, when I write about the long distant past, I can very freely write about real people without feeling that they're ever going to come knocking on my door and object to it. So there are great pros and cons to both the contemporary and the historical for me, and I could never give up one of them, you know. And what's funny is my publishers used to say to me, please, more historical, that sells better, you know, and then Room surprised them. So it's always a comfort to me to realise the publishers have no idea what's going to sell. Like my novel Slammerkin, you know, my publishers at the time dumped me on both sides of the Atlantic. They all said it would never sell, and it sold better than any of my ones up to then had sold. So it's been very cheering to me to realise that. I do actually feel a lot of responsibility, and now not every historical fiction writer would. Many of them say, oh, it's all fiction. Some of them would even claim they don't do any research, or they would say that they're being postmodern about the whole thing. I'm pretty old-fashioned. I like to at least tell my readers how much I've borrowed from the record and how much I haven't. And when I change things, they're usually, I would say, the letter rather than the spirit. I change things like the timing of events. I try and speed things up because life is very slow, and in legal cases in particular, really boring delays. So I have a novel about a divorce case called The Sealed Letter, and that divorce case took about 2.5 years to get through the courts, and so I squeezed it into a couple of months. So I would say I change things like that. I try not to change the spirit of people. Like I have never taken, you know, some perfectly nice San Francisco woman and turned her into an evil baby farmer. You know, I try to, in a way, be nourished by what I can find out about these people and to work with what I know rather than just deciding to reverse it. Because if I was going to reverse it, then I should just make up that person in the first place. So I suppose, in a way, I only welcome into my books the ones for whom there's evidence about their character that makes me think that they will work well in my story, you know. And so I have no real reason to change them very much. And I definitely feel obliged to try and get it right. I mean, it worries me a lot that I do blame this murder on somebody who may not have done it, because we can't be sure who did it. So that bit does worry me. But then I say to myself, the long dead are probably thrilled to be resurrected and given a little moment in the spotlight, even if they're accused of a murder they haven't committed. I just feel, especially, you know, this crew of show-offs, you know, exhibitionists and people swanking around town, I think they would have loved a little extra attention. So I feel better about that.
In whom, how difficult was it to write as if you had never been in the world? I thought that was fascinating, the way you, and so many times I was struck by, how did you know that? I mean, you didn't walk stairs. Is that difficult?
I suppose it was a work of just hard imagination, meaning I had to do a lot of sitting around staring into space and even self-correcting. Like I wrote some line in which Jack said that the plant that he's touching in room, it's got fuzzy leaves, it's an African violet, and he said it was fuzzy like a dog. And then I thought, hang on, he's seen dogs on the television, but he's never touched one. He doesn't know dogs are fuzzy, so I took that out. But in some ways it was very easy because once I had decided on the contents of the room, and decided, say, what television programs he could plausibly have seen and which particular pop songs his mother would have taught him. Once I decided on the contents of his head, he was a wonderfully known character to me. Whereas if you're starting to write something set in the mind of somebody who's 80 and has lived in many different continents, there's just no limit to what might be in their head. Whereas Jack, in a way, he was my creation. And I had decided everything about him to the point where I felt like his captor. There was I choosing which particular 5 books he would have. I mean, that's just cruelty, you know. And I couldn't make them all the 5 best books because how likely is it that the kidnapper would go buy the perfect collection, you know? So I had to make them sort of out of copyright books that he might have bought for $1 somewhere, like Alice in Wonderland, or just random books. I put in one random, you know, boring board book about Digger. Yeah, I would say Jack took a lot of work to make, as it were, but after that, his perspective was just so consistently interesting to me because he would see things differently. So it was a great kind of exercise as a writer, you know, to have a completely limited world. I think, for instance, of I think it's Aristotle's theory of the unities, that, you know, the ideal place should be one time, one place, one person, and similarly with room, it was sort of ideal having these 2 people in a room and, you know, having it so wonderfully contained. And child's eye fiction is just a joy. You know, there's a long tradition of it, and I think it's wonderful how it gives the adult reader this entry into a child's mind, and then, of course, the adult reader knows a lot the child doesn't. So there's this awful kind of painful gap where the adult reader is thinking, oh no, well, that man is a kidnapper and you don't realize it. And so the adult reader, in a way, takes on this parental role to the child as well as empathizing with the child. And similarly, I wanted to make the adult reader feel so much like the child that at times they're relating to the Ma character like she's their mother. So in the second half, when she takes a rather reckless decision, a lot of readers were angry with her, as if she had let them down, you know, as if she'd become the bad mother. So I just love entangling the readers in these complicated little psychodramas, you know. I find most readers are willing to do a lot of work, and not just mental work, but emotional work. And I just love that you can make all this happen just with words on a page. Yes, sir?
How important is organized religion to you as a researcher when you put a plot together?
How important is organized religion? It completely depends on the book. I would say in the case of this book, it really had no role, but there's a future book I'm writing which will be set in 19th century Ireland, and I've been reading up on the most, you know, detailed devotional practices that Cardinal Cullen brought in the 1860s. So it all depends. I would say it's like my policy on sex in my books. Many of my books have no sex, and some of my books, like this one, have a lot. So it all depends what the book seems to need, you know.
I was wondering, when you finished Room, you finished that book, do you have a period of time where you're not writing, or you're always writing? So, but does the next idea come? Do you start immediately? Where does that
I've always had the next idea already, you see. Because when you're writing a book, it's sort of like you're married, okay? And then sometimes you think, oh, that's a nice idea over there. And that idea is desirable, not because it's better than the one you're living with, just because it's new. The grass is just greener. And sometimes I even sneak off for a couple of days and I do a little bit of advanced research on the far distant idea. And then I rush back and I work hard on the book I'm working on. But then as soon as I've done a first draft of the book I'm working on, and I send it off to my agent, and I want a few weeks to pass so that I'll be able to look at it afresh, then I'll go off and do a few more weeks of work on the next thing. And twice I had babies, so I stopped for 6 weeks for each of those. But apart from that, apart from that, I know, well, we live in Canada, so my partner had 9 months fully paid parental leave. Fabulous. So I was all right through having the babies, I was able to, work at least a couple of hours every day. So I've never had to stop being a writer. And also I would say writing in this sort of layered way of, a draft of this and then turn to something else, it helps ward off writer's block because you don't ever sit down and say, I'm going to write the first line of my next novel. There's never a blank page. It's more like, you're going around a garden saying, oh, those will need to be thinned out and I better harvest that one or I should plant that one. It's like I have all these books, either ongoing or future, which need different amounts of care at different times. And I absolutely love writing. I mean, I don't want a break from it, I'm always, when I'm on an airplane, I always think, if I'm in the middle of a book, I think I can't die till I finish the book.
We've got time for maybe two more.
Can you tell us about your journey from Ireland to Cambridge University?
Sure. Well, I wanted to get out of Ireland. It was 1990, and it seemed a good moment to leave. And I knew I wouldn't really grow up till I left home. Right through my first degree, I'd been living at home and going home to my mammy's dinners every night. So I knew it would be good for me to leave, and I knew I wanted to be an academic, well, as far as I knew. And my dad was such a dominating presence in Irish literature. Dennis Donahue, he's still alive and well and publishing his latest book from Harvard this month. But I knew that if I stayed in Irish academe, I just couldn't possibly emerge from his shadow. So I thought, well, I'll do something on 18th century English fiction because he hasn't written very much on that. And also, I knew in Cambridge you could do a PhD in 3 years. So I was in a hurry and I thought, I'll do that. I didn't realize it would take me 8 because I would start writing novels on the side. So really, I went to Cambridge on full funding from the British government. And I remember thinking, this is a laugh, they're funding me to write novels and they don't even know it. But I had a great 8 years there. I was very happy there. And then I moved to Canada. So I'm an emigrant twice over, which I think, although personally a little uncomfortable at times, 'cause some days I'm not quite sure which city in the world I'd like to be in because none of them has all the perfect elements. You end up a bit discontented with everywhere. But I think for a writer it's very good. I think it gives you always that slight outsider's vision, that slight sense of being new in the world, and that's all to the good.
Would you say something about going to Canada, the culture?
Sure. I felt enormously welcomed in Canada immediately because they really celebrate their writers, and in Canada the sense of national identity is so loosey-goosey, frankly, that they're calling you a Canadian author within 6 months and they're slapping Canadian author stickers on your books, and they have no sense of a distinction between the kind of true Canadian-born Canadian and then immigrants. I mean, the immigrants are Canadians. They're central to Canada. And Canadian literature is absolutely full of people like Michael Ondaatje, who are, relatively newly in Canada, or Hinton Mystery, some of the biggest names. So I felt let in a way that I don't think as a Canadian going to Ireland, I would have felt let into the canon of Irish literature quite that fast. So for me, it was very easy to feel at home there. But I continue to go back to Ireland a lot. For instance, we're doing a film of Room, and I'm working with an Irish director, Lenny Abrahamson, and I've been going back a lot to work with him and him over to me. So it's very good to keep up working relationships.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Go off and do a few more weeks of work on the next thing. And twice I had babies, so I stopped for 6 weeks for each of those. But apart from that, I know, well, we live in Canada, so my partner had 9 months fully paid parental leave. Fabulous. So I was all right through having the babies, I was able to, work at least a couple of hours every day. So I've never had to stop being a writer. And also I would say writing in this sort of layered way of, a draft of this and then turn to something else, it helps ward off writer's block because you don't ever sit down and say, I'm going to write the first line of my next novel. There's never a blank page. It's more like, you're going around a garden saying, oh, those will need to be thinned out and I better harvest that one or I should plant that one. It's like I have all these books, either ongoing or future, which need different amounts of care at different times. And I absolutely love writing. I mean, I don't want a break from it, I'm always, when I'm on an airplane, I always think, if I'm in the middle of a book, I think I can't die till I finish the book.
We've got time for maybe two more.
Can you tell us about your journey from Ireland to Cambridge University?
Sure. Well, I wanted to get out of Ireland. It was 1990, and it seemed a good moment to leave. And I knew I wouldn't really grow up till I left home. You know, right through my first degree, I'd been living at home and going home to my mammy's dinners every night. So I knew it would be good for me to leave, and I knew I wanted to be an academic, well, as far as I knew. And my dad was such a dominating presence in Irish literature. Dennis Donahue, he's still alive and well, and publishing his latest book from Harvard this month. But I knew that, you know, if I stayed in Irish academe, I just couldn't possibly emerge from his shadow. So I thought, well, I'll do something on 18th century English fiction, because he hasn't written very much on that. And also, I knew in Cambridge you could do a PhD in 3 years. So I was in a hurry, and I thought, oh, I'll do that. I didn't realize it would take me 8, because I would start writing novels on the side. So really, I went to Cambridge on full funding from the British government. And I remember thinking, this is a laugh, you know, they're funding me to write novels and they don't even know it. But I had a great 8 years there. I was very happy there. And then I moved to Canada. So I'm an emigrant twice over, which I think, although personally a little uncomfortable at times, 'cause some days I'm not quite sure which city in the world I'd like to be in, because none of them has all the perfect elements. You know, you end up a bit discontented with everywhere. But I think for a writer, it's very good. I think it gives you always that slight outsider's vision, that slight sense of being new in the world, and that's all to the good.
Would you say something about going to Canada, the culture?
Sure. I felt enormously welcomed in Canada immediately, because they really celebrate their writers, and in Canada the sense of national identity is so loosey-goosey, frankly, that they're calling you a Canadian author within 6 months, and they're slapping Canadian author stickers on your books, you know, and they have no sense of a distinction between the kind of true Canadian-born Canadian and then immigrants. I mean, the immigrants are Canadians. They're central to Canada. And Canadian literature is absolutely full of people like Michael Ondaatje, who are, you know, relatively newly in Canada, or Hinton Mystery, some of the biggest names. So I felt let in a way that I don't think as a Canadian going to Ireland I would have felt let into the canon of Irish literature quite that fast. So for me it was very easy to feel at home there. But I continue to go back to Ireland a lot. For instance, we're doing a film of Room, and I'm working with an Irish director, Lenny Abrahamson, and I've been going back a lot to work with him and him over to me. So it's very good to keep up working relationships.